This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in. They'll never let the true facts come of their boards to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions, yeah.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 198. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we're going to throw a little curveball into the mix. I guess depart from the format of our recent series-heavy episode roster.
Yeah, I guess that's true. We did On Jinima, which
we did on
maybe
Jinima.
We'll come back. Yeah, we did Leprechauns.
Secret Machine Music is what people have been listening to, which is now we're intermitting.
We did The Simpsons. I don't know if this will come out before or after The Simpsons, but
maybe this will. This is of a piece, I think, actually, with The Simpsons episode a little bit, because we got into a little bit of meta commentary with The Simpsons episode that bleeds into. I think we mentioned several times that we had noticed that there's a certain genre of reply guy on Twitter specifically that typically speaking are huge detractors of us or are not fans for a variety of reasons, but that's also a meta topic I guess we are going to touch on today if people on Twitter who don't like SJ. But we're taking them actually a much wider meta frame
yes,
with this.
It's not a drama episode. It's actually I think we have a pretty interesting topic, but I think it does have to do with a discourse in which our podcast maybe is implicated in a way. This is an idea that occurred to me to do, which is kind of about the history or a history of uses of the term parapolitics, because I feel our podcast, I think, has always been somewhat associated with or we've always had kind of a community. Obviously we have the Grotto on Discord, but we've also had kind of a community around us on Twitter. We've been pretty active on that platform from early on. I know now we do Instagram and all that stuff, but first, I feel Twitter was and I, both of us have been on and used Twitter for years. We've made friendships and relationships on Twitter. Some of those friendships and relationships changed or turned sour over time. But
to put it mildly,
yeah, it took an intense turn. But
and
I think I've noticed lately that there certainly has been a discourse on Twitter about, or X, and that goes to the point, which is that, another thing I think is that, this is episode 197, I think we said, it might not actually
either 197 or 198.
It's in the upper 90s. And we're getting close to our 200th numerical episode. Not our 200th actual episode, but our 200th numerical episode. So we're a little reflective and things like that. And I've certainly noticed, as I was saying, on Twitter recently, a little bit of discourse around the political valence of quote unquote parapolitics. Parapolitics, I feel if you listen to the show, that which not everyone who talks about us does, but if you listen to the show, that parapolitics, at least for me, and I think for both of us, it's one of those terms that we'll certainly use because it's convenient and it's a good way to simplify things, and we'll certainly use it kind of as a polite term for like marginal or unofficial political discourses are almost as like a polite term for conspiracy theory, right? Like,
right.
Because we certainly do talk about things like in that sphere, right? But at the same time, I've said similar things about like terms like supernatural, paranormal, or even like terms like mystical. Like they're like not really terms that I like, even though I do at times use them because out of convenience or lack of a better word, because parapolitics seems to sort of create like a discourse that is outside politics, right? By its very name, something that's, sort of in some way beyond or peripheral to like quote unquote real politics, right?
Right.
And so I like, many people see this as like I think partially because, I know that Jimmy, who has now retired, another reason to kind of feel reflective, right? He kind of started his show identifying strongly with parapolitics as one of his topics, but I've never felt that like we're like a parapolitics podcast. We've talked about like we've characterized it by deep politics, which is certainly a term that Peter Dale Scott does use. Someone who also, as we'll talk about, certainly propounded like his own idea of parapolitics, but
totally.
Also like
deep history, I guess, is in our tagline, which is I feel like I've seen.
I thought we said occult history and deep politics. See, like
you're right. It is occult history, deep politics. Yeah. So we use deep politics.
Yeah, but we're not necessarily using it in the Scotian sense per se. Just like like getting into like the deep politics of something, right? Like maybe we're like evoking him in some way, but it's not meant to be like this. I feel like our podcast is very topically broad. And we certainly don't want to set ourselves aside from like discussing actual politics. Is podcasting like was political praxis in and of itself? Certainly not, right?
No.
Like this is something to fill those like empty spaces. Like everyone needs to recreate themselves, right? And a lot of people find enjoyment in listening to a conversation on the kind of intellectual, political, like esoteric topics that Dimitri and I and occasionally guests discuss on the show, right? But we do not, and I think that's something that I've always like, recoiled from, as I think I was mentioning not too long ago on an episode, I forget which, but is this sort of idea that like if you have a podcast like that is like a form of movement politics, or you're like positioning yourself as a leader in some kind of movement, right? Like obviously we have a certain responsibility to our listeners, right?
Totally.
And we try to honor that responsibility. However, like
even though we still are in the grand scheme of things a very niche podcast that doesn't make nearly as much money as other podcasters that have way bigger platforms, so you shouldn't compare us in a one-to-one kind of way with people who are millionaires, because like we have neither the reach nor the fat money bags that they do. So
no,
sorry,
right. I mean,
I've seen that
like
even the fact that if people know who a podcast is, then you're on the equal plane with like Joe Rogan and like other people that make a shitload of money, and like we're still like a tiny little boat, kind of like sliding in and out. We're like a little X-wing. I hate to use a Star Wars metaphor, but like we're the little X-wing. We're not the Star Destroyer. You know what I mean? Like we're still like underdog media in the grand scheme of things. I don't want to overdetermine it like we're the most underdog people ever, but like we've operated a niche show according to our specific interests and kind of expertise and backgrounds and things like that, and we try to cover as wide a scope as we can like within those expertises. And I think we do, I mean, the topics that we cover are things that like I think we genuinely care about. So in one sense, I can't really say it's like, oh, we seek to have no influence on anybody, because like I care about these things and think they should have influence on the way we think about the world. And that's why, I think we are driven to like do this whole project. So on that sense,
you're
I think
it's a delicate balancing act where it's like, if people start treating you like you are influential and like you're a leader of something, then that like even if you don't really want it, that like creates a kind of responsibility. And I think that like trying to push that responsibility away can actually be like worse than not taking it in some way, right? So you don't want to encourage people to like see you as like, like leading the barricades for Bernie or what the fuck ever. But like, on one end of the spectrum, but the other end of the spectrum, you don't want to like, be you don't want to like shirk whatever responsibility the influence that you do have gives you. Right. And,
or just like be so afraid of the idea of having any sort of like influence or visibility as like a content creator or a person who puts their opinions out on the internet that like somehow it's either going to corrupt you or like the deep state's going to come and like kill you immediately or something like that. Like you're going to be destroyed if you ever actually venture beyond like a tiny little Twitter account that does research and like hides in group chats and like you're so afraid of like having influence, or like you have such a view that like anybody that has any kind of influence whatsoever is sus, like ipso facto, which I can understand like why one would kind of think that up to a point, right, in our society, right?
Yeah.
Because when you look at the people that are like very, very successful, most of them are like pretty sus. But then, I mean, then there's another point I think you were telling me before we started recording about how, there's definitely like a spectrum and like there are degrees of kind of complicity if you want to like go there and draw like everyone's complicity to this evil empire that we live in and this exploitative economic system, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's like we're all, I think if you look hard enough, like most people can find some kind of like implication of, either their job or, their relatives or whatever, something in their lives that like ties back to like the imperial machine.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that you're a conscious actor or whatever, like, or that you're like an automaton that is like you just like, blah, blah, blah. Like we do have a certain level of like agency and self-awareness that we can cultivate and exercise. But anyways, I forgot what my ultimate point was with that, but I think maybe that's the opposite of like, I don't know, embracing being a heckin' political leader versus like you're so over. I hesitate to say overnoided, or maybe that's just paranoid, but like so, I don't know, like scared of the whole thing that you don't engage, because if nobody engages in like the info war,
right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like somebody's got to participate in the info war, right?
Yes.
Right.
But I also think that like, yeah, exactly. Someone's going to participate in the info war, but in so doing, like, okay, so what I was kind of thinking of is that once you like, and I did experience this whiplash, right? Like we've been subject to a lot of lies and innuendos, right? Like for instance, like the idea that we have trust funds or that like we're rich or something, like neither of us are rich at all. It's just a fact. Like, did we have like proletarian upbringings? By no means. No. But like, we're like absolutely like,
we're PMC,
bourgeois, like,
you could say petty bourgeois, upper middle class, PMC, like suburban, college educated, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
All that shit, which I do stress sometimes is not the it's not the same thing as being like, say like an heir to like the largest insurance company in like the country, like, or just other things like that. I
didn't like hang out with Quentin Tarantino growing up and things like that, no, but like I also didn't like really, I didn't have like financial hardship growing up. My parents sacrificed things that they would have liked to have, obviously. But as a kid, like I wasn't like privy to that. And also like their needs, were met, especially during the time when I was growing up in the 90s,
Yes.
But like, I think there's a kind of perception, like, I don't know, people like know that like, they might have had an idea of me or whatever, but like that I was like, not from that type of background, even though I never really meant to conceal it, just because, the fact is that I'm not like so wealthy that I can afford to like take an Uber everywhere or like just always order Uber Eats to my house and not go out in the street
3 times a
and
day.
have the risk of like someone at, who's in, right, like who's in like so that's what like it's not a thing of like, oh, you didn't want to be upfront about like, if you go back to the Discord, you can see me talking quite candidly about like my family very early on from the very beginning. So and in our 9/11 episode, it's quite obvious like what kind of back, like, there's all sorts of things. Like, it's not concealing it, just like we wanted the podcast to be interesting. And I feel like this type of stuff we're talking about right now is not very interesting. Like, it's very hard to like, and that's what I'm talking about, this whiplash where it's oh, people actually are invested in and care about my life and in fact feel they're owed like an understanding of like, who I am and of my life. You know what I mean? And like that but I think that they're not completely wrong, because that's how I felt like the first time like I started getting like really, because you're right, there is a huge difference between someone who's like a public figure, right? And like, you know,
profiled in like New York
like,
Magazine and
yes,
shit,
and us, so this whole thing of like glass houses doesn't really apply. We constantly hear because we criticize people, and then like we don't like it when we get criticized. Obviously, it's not quite the same because we're not like going after like these like little accounts or whatever.
There's like more to our critique than just simply like like you're actually like a bourgeois kid, but like you
it's exactly like it is really more about actions.
Like,
especially like in a particular case. However, my point is that up to a point, like there's like, you know, not an equivalency, but there's also like there is some responsibility that comes, and there can be like, I think there was a sense of whiplash from going to just being like, I don't know, like a shit poster who can just be like, oh, like I hate this fucking whatever, and then like no one cares, to like all of a sudden like this is like a reason to like real like this is just infuriating, and like
people are invested in hitting back.
And
not the people themselves. They're all a little too, you know, chicken shit and smart and savvy to not hit back directly, but they're minions. They're parasocial fanboys, and then other assorted people that develop hatreds, you know, who are maybe a little too on Twitter, you know, kind of piling on top of that.
But
But
I also feel like, you know, this goes back to the point that I think actually is like, you know, because I think that a lot of like the drama stuff, you know, as like not very interesting, however, or like I don't even want to call it drama, but like, you know, the like some of the sort of nitty gritty here might not be. But what is interesting to me is the sort of conversation around like what is the political valence of parapolitics, you know, quote unquote parapolitics, right? Like, is parapolitics like reactionary in some way, right? Is parapolitics like a right-wing thing? Yeah, is it sus to talk about like, you know, quote unquote parapolitics?
Yeah.
So with this episode, what I think like might be interesting to do is kind of to first of all destabilize like the entire concept of parapolitics as like an essentialized thing, right? By talking about the history of this term and like the different ways people have used it, because it's not really that. You know, obviously, like there's some that are more influential in the way that like it's been applied to us, and that like we've from time to time used it, like Peter Dale Scott's formulation of it. There's also some like things that are like radically at odds with how like we would ever like conceive of parapolitics in a way that we would want to be remotely associated with.
Like they're actually the exact opposite of, but nonetheless has not stopped, I think, at least a couple people from ascribing, like, because we have had the label applied to us, and some other people back in the 60s used it in a very different and sus way to talk about something else, that like that's the agenda that like we're pushing. Because well, we'll get to it. I mean, I think if those haters had actually listened to Subliminal Jihad's episodes, they would understand that their critique was not as bulletproof as they thought, because like we've actually talked about an earlier, you know, user of the term parapolitics who was a sus lord. In fact, I think they missed how we revealed
a very important detail,
like very important thing. Like,
which
don't come at
really would have seemed like it was burning us, but
but I think that's actually an interesting jumping off point.
I don't even want to give too much space to like such like people, but like we know exactly who they are, and like you know it's just come on. Anyway, so
and they
but
know
I think
who
that
I am, so they should know better.
But anyway,
but I
think that they understand.
It's a good jump.
I think that they might understand now. But I think that, you know, they definitely like, or some of these people did like help sort of contribute to getting the, which I want to, you know, I think we can jump off in a sec. But what I want to say is that, like, you know, something that, or like a meme that I think may have originated in these things. And again, this is a very niche discourse. Like, some people who are listening, like, maybe don't go down there and haven't come across this. But I do think that it's something that we've even kind of in a way like talked about before, and something that I do think is interesting, because like a meme like that, you know, what kind of sort of percolated up from here, and that I saw even like, you know, some people who like I admire like entertaining. And I don't think that they were wrong to, because I think that there is something to this, which is like the idea of like, oh, you know, is talking about, for instance, like, you know, let's say esoterica, is talking about the occult, or talking about, you know, like werewolves or dogmen or what have you, is talking about like, you know, like quote unquote parapolitics.
Satanism.
Yeah, like is talking about that, a pipeline to like the right wing, because obviously the right wing also talks about those things, right? And
of course.
Yes. And the
like
way,
whether you're talking about the Christian right wing that kind of believes in like demons and like the devils engaging in spiritual warfare, or like weird esoteric like fascists who are like obsessed with like Nazi werewolves and like Himmler shit, right? Like there's a whole panoply of right wing obsessions with these kind of cryptozoology, UFOs, of course, the Flugelrad, like all that kind of shit, right?
Yes.
Hollow Earth theory.
Yes, and I think like an important thing to emphasize is that like certainly it's absolutely true that like there is interest in all of that stuff, as you said, on the right. However, I think the framework of like some people, and I think they're maybe being a bit bad faith and a bit tendentious, but the framework through which some people approach this is to say like, oh well, subliminal jihad is like taking all this audience of like conspiracy Marxists or whatever, and then like getting them into all this esoterica and stuff, right? And I think that like if you actually like know like the daily workings of like our interaction with our audience, things like that, like it's quite obvious that is like it's not like that, that's not the primary effect, and it's like it makes sense that it wouldn't be, because like much more popular than like conspiracy Marxism or whatever that is like esoterica, is like conspiracy theory in general, like these topics, right? They're broadly popular topics that bridge political divides. I feel that it is much more likely that someone who is interested in those topics and is apolitical or even like right-leaning, right? Or hasn't been exposed to like the left-wing ideas that, again, like from the beginning,
it is apolitical.
Yeah. And
right?
Yes, exactly. And from the beginning, like, we considered branding our podcast as like a left like podcast, right?
Right.
And like I'll take the responsibility for not like wanting to put left in our branding materials. I thought like I don't want to turn people off from listening to it, like if they have like a negative association with the word left. And
let's
like,
also remember that we launched the podcast in August 2020 at the end of like the long hot summer of discontent with like the election was about to happen, COVID was going on. And
it was a COVID project, and like we never expected project. Not that we're like crazily successful, but we never expected even the amount of success that we've had. We never expected that this would be like something that provided a substantial amount of like,
make a living off of. Though it is it's a lean living. We should emphasize.
It's a very lean living. We can't really make a living off of it, to be honest. Like
no,
we both,
like I
have
to.
Second jobs,
we need to grow 20%, or I need to get a part-time job. That's
right.
gonna pretty much do this full time.
I have two jobs, but still, like we never imagined that it would be like on this scale, but. Yeah, like so it was like a kind of a COVID fun
but when we
project.
started, we thought it was actually because there was such an abundance of like very loud leftist like election year kind of content and stuff, and it was there were a lot of very established like left wing things like I mean I am a a conspiracy Marxist, like that is who I've been for years, like that is coalesced into kind of like my Weltanschauung, and like the way I see the world. And it was always my intent to like explore a lot of these historical topics, like specifically through that lens. But I think it was more of a tactical thing to not explicitly brand us with like, I don't know, like a fist and a hammer and sickle, blah, 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 even though we definitely use that iconography at like, our merch and our episode things. And like the subject matter is obviously pretty pro-Marxist, like highly sympathetic.
Well, that's the thing. Like I never like, and I think that this is maybe why some of the people who like you bonded with over like Marxism, Leninism, like have like, because I'm not like as strongly identify with Marxism, Leninism, and like I'm religious, and that's like the primary thing that I identify with, like as being Muslim. Like that's that's like my Weltanschauung,
That's the dialectic of our show, basically.
Yes, exactly. But
we do agree like on enough important things. Like
and
politically...
it's obvious that like both of our sympathies like are with the political left. Like it's not like it's pretty clear. And again, like but my point is that like it's much more likely than like if people are going to listen to this left podcast, like, or this, like, you know, whatever, like, out of interest in, like, you know, Marxism, Leninism, or in whatever, then, like, someone with an interest in, like, the topics that we actually talk about will be exposed to that, like, framework and that sort of those ideas and that, like, you know, worldview, like, through like their interest in those topics, because those topics are way more popular. We've talked about this before, like, there's a million cable channels that are just wall to wall, like, you know, like Nazi occultism, like stuff like, you know, like Satan, like, content, you know, like, people are fascinated by that. They always have been. You know, like, people have been fascinated with the unseen world and with secret societies and with maybe, like, you could say, like, parapolitics, right? Or as the idea of, like, politics whose primary, like, aspect is hidden or something. But long before Karl Marx, like, was born. Long before.
This is and even as we pointed out, I think in our very first episode, like, a lot of the language, and other, you know, scholars have pointed this out, a lot of the language that Marx uses to describe, like, the workings of capital, you know, kind of borrows from, like, this kind of spiritual language about, like, ghosts and specters and things like that. You know, specters of Marx, right? I mean, it's like almost a meme at this point. But, like, we kind of wanted to take that a little bit seriously, and I think, you know, I would wager that, there was an interesting thing there where I think if we had really, like, marketed ourselves as, like, a leftist, like, podcast first and foremost, I think we quickly identified that there is a certain hostility on many parts, like the Western left, towards certain topics that, like, we cover, particularly as they bump up against things like religion and the quote unquote, you know, paranormal, things like that, which in a way would make it hard to, like, sell to an audience of, like, I don't know, hardcore, like, Marxists, because they'd be like, what the fuck is this? This is, like, you know, this is woo-woo, like, religious, like, fake opiate of the masses stuff. Like, you guys are just, like, distracted, like, focusing on this. But I have to say, like, over the time, I think the very particular way we've explored these dynamics, and also, like, the relationship between, I don't know, like, sometimes the similarities between, like, 20th century Marxist Leninism and, like, organized religion, I think we've plumbed that. There's still further to go, you know, I think, in plumbing that, but also, like, exploring the kind of the historical hostility between organized religion and communism, and also exploring, like, do these things need to be? I know, like, philosophically, there's certain things that they really bump up hard against each other, but, you know, I think my one, like, revisionist, like, take, if you will, and I don't even think it's that revisionist, is that, like, the really hardcore, like, Reddit atheism that I think you saw in, like, the early Soviet Union and in certain other communist countries throughout the 20th century was perhaps like a, at the very least, a tactical error. Yes, and actually, like, it backfired on them.
I agree. I don't think it's actually fair to call it Reddit, but you know, but
no, I'll give it a little more credit, because they were confronting very corrupt, like, religious institutions. Like, we should stress, like,
but
like
it was,
the
like,
Lenin versus the Orthodox Church,
uncompromising, like, and it was, like, a bit narrow and dogmatic in the way that Reddit atheism sometimes can be. You know, not to say that religion can't also be narrow and dogmatic, as everybody knows.
I'm going to say Trotsky had more of the Reddit atheist vibe, maybe.
Okay.
Let's put it on Trotsky.
But yes, like, no, but I think we've had interesting, and that's ultimately, like, what the, like, you know, this is, like, intellectual, like, recreation in a way, right? Like, it's a way to, like, re-energize yourself, like, expose you to, like, books or content or, like, ideas that you might not have encountered previously, right? Like, things that, like, might branch off into, like, you know, you might see, like, oh, that reminds me of something that I've read, you know, or just that's, like, the goal of this. Like, and these are topics that are interesting, like, curiosities, you know, like, it's not like, this is not a podcast where, like, we lay out, like, the program of, like, the future revolutionary state, like, each week, you know, or something like that. I don't know. Like, that's not...
I do see it, not to sound like...
I feel like, in a way, like, it's pointless to even, like, try to explain yourself to someone who would have that expectation, but, like, I almost feel like that... Well, anyway, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, not to sound like a, you know, like, we're like theory cells, like, retreating into, like, the podcast, academia, like, safe space, so that we don't actually have to, like, change the world, but I don't know. I do feel like...
Well, no, yes, and I do think that that's important, But I don't like, and I think that, I see
this as
I agree with those
like,
who would say this isn't sufficient on its own.
Right?
Oh yeah,
like, I would describe this kind of not to sound like a theory cell, but I would almost describe this as laying out preliminary materials for like an actual plan of action. Like these are kind of the ontological. There's a lot of ontological baggage and garbage that sort of needs to be cleared up before we can even start to like formulate. But that's not to say a given denialism kind of thing of like, oh, it's so far away, it's not going to be in our lifetimes. Like don't even like get it. Don't even try to like make it happen.
Right. No.
But maybe this is kind of this is my radical democratic centralism speaking of being like I think we do need to like keep in mind like developing philosophies and I don't know, ideological programs and things like that actually would have a chance of making a difference in the world, but also not rushing out so quickly because like we're just like in an adventurist way, like action for action's sake, like just to heckin' do something, man. Like we need to start doing stuff, like that. If you walk into that, but then you have all these mistaken assumptions about like how the world currently works and how it has worked and like what's been done to movements that tried to change it in the past, and like you're right at the tip of the iceberg is like COINTELPRO, and it's like you're gonna get fucked with if you try to do that. But then beneath the tip of the iceberg is where we get into like the wholesale manufacturing of like pseudo leftist ideologies that take on like a mind virus and like psyop an entire generation into like becoming stands of capitalism. Like I think you could argue happened to like every generation from like the boomers on down was like subject to increasingly intensifying like kind of really ontops, as we talked about from the very beginning, like ontological operations to change the way that like the American citizen thought of themselves and their relation to the economic world and the political world and everything else, and created this like this kind of a consumer that some people I think are just totally captured by, but all of us have a little consumer in us, all of us Americans I think, and probably all of us like first world Westerners, right?
And everybody really,
and everybody, even all the way it trickles all the way down, and it's like this is the true neoliberal kind of like ontology that has been sort of like incepted into us like over years using mass communications technology, using the media.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.